The day they sent in 10 bulldozers to block my driveway was the day I realized that quiet power is often the most dangerous weapon. Have you ever had your world upended by a force you never saw coming? A force so entrenched in its power that it never even considered the possibility that you might have a way to fight back. I was just a farmer, a simple man with simple needs, and I thought I had everything figured out, until I realized that sometimes the most innocent of acts can ignite a storm, and when that storm hits, it can change your life forever. The initial incident seemed so small. A request. Nothing more than a formality. A letter from the HOA, the Homeowners Association, asking me to remove the fence along my property line. It seemed laughable at first. Who would even bother with something so trivial? But that was just the beginning of something much bigger, something I couldn't have prepared for. I'd been living on this land for years, farming it like my father and his father before him. This was my home, my legacy, the place where every inch of dirt had a story, every stone had a memory, and then the HOA sent me that letter. It was nothing more than a request, or so they thought. They told me to remove the fence because it was deemed unnecessary and unsightly in their eyes. Just like that, a piece of my land, my history, was being scrutinized by people who had never even set foot on it. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I knew the HOA had certain regulations, but I'd been living here for decades. No one had ever raised an issue before. But when I ignored their request, they escalated, sending me warning letters, fines, and then the bulldozers. I'll never forget the sound of those engines. 10 bulldozers lined up in a perfect row, engines roaring as they barreled toward my property. The sight was so surreal, so absurd, that I couldn't help but laugh. They had no idea who they were dealing with. My name is Thomas Reynolds. I'm a farmer, a landowner, and a man who spent his life working the land. I've seen hard times and I've seen good times, but I've never seen something like this. The HOA had taken it too far, and they didn't know the first thing about me. I'd never shared much about my background. I didn't need to. But this wasn't just about farming, it was about my identity, and they were threatening it. They were about to take something from me that wasn't theirs to take. A fence. Yes, but beyond that, my rights, my freedom, my sense of belonging. As I stood there watching those bulldozers approach, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It wasn't even surprise. It was a quiet realization that this wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about power, the power they assumed they had over me, and the power I hadn't yet revealed. Have you ever been made to feel powerless by something you couldn't control? Something that seemed too big to challenge, too intimidating, to fight? The thing about power, though, is that it's often not what it seems. What they didn't know, what they never thought to check, was that I owned not just this piece of land, I owned the entire county. They didn't know I'd purchased every last acre, every parcel of land, every inch of soil surrounding their precious development. They didn't know that their bulldozers weren't just heading toward my driveway. They were heading toward the start of a much bigger game, one they'd never be able to win. The bulldozers rolled up to the fence, and I could hear the drivers shouting at each other. They were so sure of their mission. They were so sure that they had the upper hand. And in that moment, I decided to play a game they hadn't even considered. I wasn't angry, not in the way they might have expected. I didn't shout or make threats. I just stood there, watching them, calculating my next move. I could have called the authorities, but that would have been playing into their hands. The HOA was well connected. They had their lawyers, their money, their influence. But I had something. They didn't. A quiet, unassuming power that they would never see coming. I walked to my front porch and took a deep breath, watching the bulldozers grow closer. The decision had already been made. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze my life, my legacy, just because they didn't understand the rules. Have you ever been faced with a situation where you knew you had the strength to fight back, But you also knew that fighting loudly wouldn't solve anything. Sometimes, the most strategic thing you can do is stay calm, stay patient, and wait for the right moment. The moment that changed everything was when I walked into the office of the county clerk's office later that afternoon. I hadn't made a single phone call yet, but I knew what I needed to do. I had the paperwork in hand. The county records didn't lie, and they wouldn't be able to undo the truth. As I handed the documents to the clerk, I felt a calm sense of control wash over me. They had no idea what was coming. They were so sure of their victory, and I was about to show them just how wrong they were. I could feel the weight of every step I took through that office, the sense of quiet authority growing stronger with each passing second. I wasn't just a farmer anymore. I was a landowner. I was someone who controlled the very foundation of the place they lived in. The clerk scanned the documents, glanced at me, and smiled knowingly. She'd seen it before. I wasn't the first person to come in and claim the power they'd been hiding for years. There were others, too, who had come to realize that the HOA wasn't infallible, that they didn't hold the ultimate authority they so often believed they did. By the time I left that office, I knew it was only a matter of time before they'd find out. And when they did, it would be too late for them to do anything about it. The bulldozers might have been the start of their attack, but it would be the end of their reign. They'd tried to push me. They'd tried to make me follow their rules, to bend to their will. But they didn't know the first thing about me. They didn't know that I wasn't the kind of man who would just roll over when confronted with a challenge. I wasn't angry. I was calculating. It wasn't about the $500 fine anymore. It was about proving them wrong. It was about showing them that they could not trample on me just because they thought they could. I would not back down. I would not be bullied. This wasn't just about the fence. It was about something far bigger, something they hadn't even begun to understand. This is how the game begins. This is how power shifts, not in grand, dramatic confrontations, but in quiet moments of realization, in the space where patience meets strategy. And as I walked back to my house, I knew one thing. The bulldozers had no idea that they were about to face the greatest mistake of their lives. Do you think the powerful always win? Or do they sometimes underestimate those they deem weak? Tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew better? The next day, after the bulldozers had packed up and left, I stood on the land that had been mine for decades, staring at the mess they'd made. The scar of their machines was still fresh in the dirt, but it wasn't the dirt that concerned me. It was the system they represented, the arrogance that flowed through the HOA like blood through its veins. I'd let them play their hand, let them make their move. But now, I was going to make mine. It wasn't about being reckless. It wasn't about striking out in anger. It was about strategy. Everything up until this point had been a carefully crafted move. I'd taken one step back, allowing them to think they had me cornered. Now, it was time for them to find out just how wrong they were. The first thing I did was contact my attorney. His name was Samuel, a quiet, shrewd man who didn't waste words. I'd worked with him a few times over the years, dealing with various land disputes and other legal matters. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't get ruffled, who didn't panic when things got complicated, and things were about to get very complicated. "Thomas," he said when I called, "I take it you've got a problem with the HOA?" "More than just a problem," I replied. "They're blocking my driveway, trying to take control of my land." "I'll get started right away," he said, his voice calm. He knew me well enough to know that I wasn't someone who would take this lying down. But as I sat in my office later that day, the walls lined with old farming equipment and family photos, it became clear to me that the fight was going to be much bigger than I had initially thought. I didn't just need legal advice. I needed to understand how deep the HOA's reach went. I needed to know everything about them, their financial backing, their connections, the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, because I had a feeling that what they had done to me wasn't an isolated incident. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were using those rules to control people. I started my investigation the next morning. The first place to look was the HOA's records. In a small town like this, everything was public knowledge, or at least it should be. I went down to the county clerk's office again, this time with a different purpose in mind. I wasn't just looking for deeds or titles. I was looking for something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. I spent hours going through their records, page after page of contracts, bylaws, and meeting minutes. It was tedious work, but I was determined. I could feel the puzzle, pieces starting to fit together as I sifted through the documents, and that's when I found it. The first red flag was Karen Wellington. She was listed as the head of the HOA board, and her name appeared over and over again in meetings and contracts, always at the center of things. At first glance, nothing about her seemed unusual. She was just another name on a list of volunteers running a neighborhood association. But as I dug deeper, I found something more troubling. In the minutes from a recent HOA meeting, she had pushed for increased fines and fees for residents who didn't comply with their regulations. The reasoning was flimsy, claiming it was to improve the neighborhood. But it didn't take a genius to see that these fines were an easy way to generate revenue. Revenue that would go straight into the HOA's pockets. Then, I found a document that really made my stomach churn. It was a list of properties the HOA had seized or threatened to seize due to unpaid fines. The list was long, far longer than I had expected. And right at the top of that list were families who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, families who had been driven to the brink by the constant pressure from the HOA. I didn't need to be a detective to see what was going on. Karen Wellington wasn't just running a neighborhood association. She was running a racket, a system designed to drain money from the very people she was supposed to be serving. And what was worse, she was using the power of the HOA to manipulate the rules, to create opportunities for herself and her associates to profit. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a simple land dispute. This was about an entire system of corruption, where the residents were the ones paying the price while the board members lined their pockets. I could feel my blood starting to boil, but I held it together. Anger wasn't going to help me now. Strategy would. I took the documents back to Samuel, who didn't seem surprised by any of it. "This is exactly what I expected," he said, flipping through the papers. "This is textbook corruption. They've been doing this for years." "So, what do we do about it?" I asked. "We don't go in guns blazing," Samuel said, his tone steady. "We play the long game. We need to expose them, quietly, without drawing too much attention. The more noise we make, the harder it'll be to pull this off. But if we can get the right leverage, we can put them in a position where they have no choice but to back down." I spent the next few weeks gathering everything I could, documents, testimonies, and anything that could help me build a case. But what struck me the most was how deeply the system had permeated the community. I had spoken to several of my neighbors, people I'd known for years, and more often than not, they were too scared to speak out. They were afraid of the repercussions. The HOA had fostered an atmosphere of fear, making everyone believe that if they didn't comply, they'd lose everything. But I wasn't afraid. I was never going to be afraid again, and that was the difference between me and the others. They were too afraid to act, too afraid to speak up. I wasn't. And that was why I was going to win. I called a meeting with a few key neighbors who had also been affected by the HOA's actions. Merrick, a retired teacher who had been fined for his garden fence, and Carla, a young mother who had been told to remove a playset for violating community aesthetics. Together, we began to piece together the full extent of the HOA's control, realizing that Karen's reign was built on manipulation and fear. But we weren't going to let her win. We weren't going to let her control us any longer. It wasn't just about the land or the fines anymore. It was about taking back what was ours. It was about giving the community the strength to stand up against the people who had been quietly pulling the strings for so long. By the time I'd gathered all the information I needed, I was more determined than ever to see this through. We had the leverage, and it was time to use it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen wasn't going to be an easy target. She had the support of the town's most influential people, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The battle was just beginning, and I wasn't going to let up. Every piece of information, every step I took was calculated. I had learned from my father, from my grandfather. I was patient, and I knew that in the end, it would be my quiet power that would win. And so, I prepared. Because the truth was, they didn't know who they were up against. They didn't know I owned the county, and they didn't know how far I was willing to go to protect it. But they were about to find out. The morning sun had just begun to stretch its fingers across the horizon, casting a golden light over the land as I stood in my kitchen, sipping my coffee. The tranquility of the moment felt almost surreal compared to the storm that was about to come. For weeks now, I'd been planning, collecting evidence, and working my connections. The ground had been carefully prepared, and now it was time to set everything into motion. I wasn't going to be hasty or reckless. I was going to play this carefully, strategically. I walked to my desk where the stack of documents lay. They had been my lifeblood for the past month, each piece representing a small step toward taking down the corrupted system that had been suffocating this town. The evidence was irrefutable. It wasn't just about the illegal fines or Karen's manipulation of HOA rules. It was the deeper layers of corruption that had seeped into every part of the community. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA was nothing more than a facade, a tool for greed and control. I had already briefed Samuel, my lawyer, on the findings. The documents showed that Karen Wellington was not just the head of the HOA. She was also involved in numerous real estate deals that directly benefited her from the fines and penalties she imposed on the residents. And the land that had been seized by the HOA? It was often sold off to developers at below-market prices, with Karen receiving kickbacks on the side. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. But with every new discovery came a new piece of the puzzle, and with it, a clearer path forward. I made a call to Merrick, one of the neighbors who had helped me gather information. His knowledge of the community's history had been invaluable in connecting the dots. I needed him today more than ever. "Thomas," Merrick answered, his voice gruff but steady. "What's the plan?" "We're going public," I said. "It's time to pull the curtain back and show everyone what's really been going on. But we do it carefully, quietly. We're not looking for a showdown. We're looking for leverage." Merrick was silent for a moment. I knew he understood what I meant. This wasn't going to be a simple legal battle. It was going to be a social one as well. We needed to expose Karen for what she was. Someone who'd used her position for personal gain, someone who'd manipulated people's lives without a second thought, but we couldn't just throw it all out there at once. We had to be smart. "Got it," Merrick replied. "I'll spread the word to the others. We'll be ready." As I hung up, I felt the weight of everything settle in. This wasn't just about a driveway. It wasn't even just about the land anymore. This was about reclaiming control, not just for me, but for everyone in the community who had been bullied and pushed around by people like Karen. It was about restoring balance. I took another sip of my coffee and turned to look out the window where the bulldozed path had once stood. The thought of those machines driven by people who thought they could trample on my rights still made my blood boil. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would get me nowhere. This had to be done with precision. The next step was clear. The county records office held everything I needed. The connections between Karen and the developers, the shady deals that had taken place under the table, the conflicts of interest, everything was buried there, hidden in plain sight. The information was powerful, but in order to use it, I had to present it in a way that left no room for doubt. I drove to the courthouse, the weight of what I was about to do settling on my shoulders. This was the moment when everything would change. If I was successful, Karen's power over the HOA would be shattered. The corruption that had been festering in this town would be exposed, and it would be too late for anyone to stop it. At the courthouse, I walked up to the records department, my heart beating with a calm rhythm. Samuel had arranged for us to have a private meeting with the district attorney to discuss the findings. We had carefully organized everything. We were going to bring everything into the light, piece by piece. I walked into the meeting room and saw Samuel sitting across from the district attorney, a man named Raymond Harris. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and I knew I was going to have to make a strong case to get him to take action. "Mr. Reynolds," Harris said, standing to shake my hand. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over. I have to admit, they're more than a little disturbing. If what you've uncovered is true, it could have serious repercussions for the HOA and for Karen Wellington personally. But I need to know, what exactly do you want from me?" I sat down and looked at Harris. "I want action," I said. "I want Karen Wellington and the HOA to be held accountable for what they've done to the residents of this county. I want to make sure that they can never do this again." Harris nodded. "And how do you propose we do that?" "We've already started gathering support from the community," I replied. "People are fed up with the way they've been treated. We've collected enough evidence to prove that Karen Wellington has used her position to manipulate the system and that the HOA has been systematically targeting residents to generate revenue for their own personal gain. But we need to expose her. We need to make sure the public knows what's really going on behind the scenes." Harris leaned back in his chair, thinking. I could tell he was weighing the situation carefully. This wasn't a simple case. It was a complicated web of corruption, and I knew that if we were going to take it down, it had to be done right. "I'll get in touch with some of my contacts," Harris finally said. "This is a big deal, and it's going to take some time. But I'm willing to help. We'll need to approach this strategically. If we move too fast, we could lose the element of surprise." "Understood," I said, "but we move now. We can't wait. People have suffered long enough." Harris gave me a look that told me he understood the urgency. "We'll move forward, but I need you to be patient. This is a delicate situation." As I left the courthouse, the weight of the situation began to settle over me. We had taken the first step toward exposing Karen Wellington and the corrupt HOA, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. This was going to take time, effort, and most of all, patience. Back home, I gathered the others, Merrick, Carla, and a few of the other residents who had been victims of the HOA's tactics. We were going to move forward with the plan. We were going to stand together and fight back. But the fight wasn't going to be flashy. It wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be precise, calculated, and methodical. We weren't going to let the bulldozers win. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, legal filings, and quiet planning. Each step was taken with precision, each move carefully calculated. We worked with the district attorney, gathering evidence, building our case. Karen had no idea what was coming. She thought she had all the power, but she was about to find out how wrong she was. One morning, as I was heading to the courthouse for yet another meeting, I got the call I had been waiting for. Samuel's voice was on the other end of the line, and he sounded confident. "We've got her," he said. "It's time." I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized what that meant. Karen's reign was about to end. She had no idea that her carefully constructed empire was on the verge of collapse. And when it fell, it would be because of one simple truth: the quiet strength of a man who knew how to play the game better than she ever could. The morning after I received the call from Samuel, I stood at the front of my property. watching the sunrise as I had done so many times before. The air was crisp, the land stretched out before me, silent and peaceful. But I knew deep down that this tranquility was about to be shattered, not by any noise or confrontation, but by something much more subtle. The quiet fallout of the actions we had set in motion, the weight of our strategy slowly bearing fruit. The first step had been to gather enough evidence to ensure that Karen Wellington's carefully constructed empire would crumble. But the work we had done behind the scenes, the countless hours spent sifting through public records, private documents, and interviews with disgruntled residents, had all been a means to an end. Now, we had the leverage we needed, and it was time to apply it. The meeting with the district attorney, Raymond Harris, had been pivotal. He was more than just a legal professional. He was someone who understood how deeply corruption could run, especially in small communities like ours. He knew that if Karen and the HOA weren't stopped now, they would only continue to exploit their power, pushing more and more residents into financial ruin. I could see the weight of the situation on his face, but I also knew that, with the evidence we'd collected, the system had no choice but to act. We had already sent out feelers to the press, carefully crafting a story that painted Karen and the HOA not just as corrupt, but as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. We were going to expose their hypocrisy, their manipulation, and most importantly, their greed. But we weren't going to do it by storming in with headlines screaming for blood. No, we were going to do it quietly, methodically, through press releases and well-placed leaks to the right media outlets. The truth would spread slowly, but like wildfire, it would eventually consume them. The turning point came 3 days later. Samuel had arranged for a quiet sit-down with the town council. I wasn't invited, because honestly they weren't going to do anything until the evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that this meeting was critical. The council had been in Karen's pocket for years, and now they were going to have to reckon with everything they had allowed to happen under their watch. The council meeting took place behind closed doors, but the news spread quickly. As I watched the vehicles drive past my farm that afternoon, I could see the undercurrent of change beginning to ripple through the community. It wasn't visible in any grand, dramatic way. It wasn't in the form of protests or town hall meetings. It was in the hushed conversations, the looks exchanged between neighbors, the slight shift in the air. Something was happening, something big. The HOA's grip on the community was slipping. That evening, Karen Wellington herself called me. I hadn't heard from her since the bulldozer incident, and I'd thought it was over for her. She had no idea that she was already being outflanked, her position disintegrating by the minute. I almost didn't answer the phone, but then I remembered how far we'd come. This was her moment of desperation, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. Thomas! Her voice crackled through the receiver. I know what you've been doing. You've been going through records, trying to dig up dirt, trying to make me look bad, but you won't win. You can't win. This is bigger than you. Her words were sharp, laced with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of having your will imposed on others. But I wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. I don't need to win, Karen, I said, my voice calm, steady. I've already won. You just don't know it yet. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I wondered if she had truly realized the depth of her mistake. But then she spoke again, her tone colder. You're a fool if you think you can take me down. I've been in charge here for years. I have the town council, the developers, and the law behind me. No one's going to listen to you. No, I replied. But they'll listen to the truth. And once that truth gets out, you'll have no choice but to answer for it. Her laugh was bitter, mocking. You think you've exposed everything? You don't have a clue how far I'll go to protect this. You think the residents will back you? They're scared, Thomas. You're the one who's alone in this fight. It was true that fear had kept many people silent for years. The HOA had built an atmosphere where people were too afraid to speak out. But that fear was fading. I could feel it. And Karen? She was running scared. Her words, her tone, they betrayed her fear more than any action ever could. Karen, I said, you don't get it. This isn't just about a fence or a driveway. This is about power. And you're about to lose yours. It's already happening, and you're too blind to see it. I hung up the phone before she could respond, knowing that this was the last time she would have any real control over the situation. From this point forward, it would be a matter of time before the community, the media, and the legal system all converged on her. 3 days later, the town council convened, and it wasn't the usual rubber stamping of decisions that I had come to expect. The weight of everything we had uncovered hung over that room. Karen, no longer the confident, manipulative leader, was now a woman exposed. She had no allies left in the council. The evidence of her corruption, her conflicts of interest, and the systematic exploitation of the residents had been laid bare. Even the developers who had once turned a blind eye to her practices were now distancing themselves, realizing that their association with her could mean legal and financial ruin. By the end of the meeting, Karen's position was untenable. The HOA's board was disbanded, and the council announced a full investigation into Karen's dealings, along with a reevaluation of every fine, every penalty, and every seizure made under her leadership. The community was shaken to its core, but in the weeks that followed, the sense of change was palpable. People were talking again. People were standing up for their rights, and they knew now more than ever that they had a voice. Karen was eventually arrested, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and several counts of abuse of power. Her wealth and her connections couldn't save her this time. It was over for her, and in the wake of her downfall, the HOA crumbled. The residents, once living in fear, began to rebuild their community with a sense of unity and purpose. The legal system, no longer clouded by Karen's influence, began to work for the people, not against them. As for me, I watched from the sidelines, quietly proud of what had been accomplished. My role in the downfall of Karen Wellington and the HOA wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about restoring balance, about giving the community back its power, and in doing so, I had found something within myself that I hadn't known existed. A quiet, unshakable strength that allowed me to stand firm in the face of adversity, to outlast those who thought they could push me around. I walked through my fields, looking at the land that had always been mine, and I knew that everything had changed. Not just for me, but for the people around me. The legacy of Karen Wellington was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a story of how power can corrupt, how those who believe themselves invincible can be brought low by the truth. As the sun set behind me, casting long shadows across the land, I realized something important. True power doesn't come from loud declarations or grand gestures. It comes from knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to wait. It comes from having the patience to play the long game, knowing that in the end, quiet strength can move mountains. And as I stood there, I felt the peace that comes with knowing you've done what's right, not through force, but through intelligence, patience, and the courage to fight back when it matters most. In the end, they all underestimated me. But it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about rebuilding what they had tried to tear down. And for that, I was at peace.